I've entitled this particular chapter, The Revenge Upon Saul's House for the Gibeonites. The revenge upon Saul's house for the Gibeonites. True or false? Saul at this time has been dead several years. That's true. Okay? And that just, just that thought and the title of the chapter combined caused me to ask a lot of questions. Okay? But maybe we'll ask some of those as we go through the lesson, all right? Anybody want to give us a good outline of the chapter? All right, Jim, go for it. Point 1. Okay, a 3-year famine. Number 2. Okay, the Gibeonites do what now with them? To have 7 sons of Saul. Well, that's almost a tongue twister. Mephibosheth is spared. Good. Okay, David gives us the 7 sons to the Gibeonites, and they're hung. Rizpah guards the bodies. Good. Okay, the bones of Saul and his sons are gathered. Okay, buried in the scepter of Kish. Good. There's a lot of sections here. That's my doing, not yours. You could probably condense some of that, okay, if you really wanted to, but you don't have to. I've got this. David inquires about the famine. Okay, number 2. David inquires a solution by the Gibeonites. I find that interesting. Number 3, David imparts deliverance to Mephibosheth. Number 4, the Gibeonites impale Saul's sons to the wall. Number 5, Rizpah insulates the bodies from birds and beasts. Number 6, David inters the bones of Saul and his sons. And then lastly, God entreated for the land. 7 sections to this particular a section of 2 Samuel. The revenge upon Saul's house for the Gibeonites. How long was there a famine in the land in the days of David? 3 years, and there was a famine in the days of David. 3 years, year after year. Why do you think they put that little phrase, year after year, in there? Yes, to show that it was consecutively. Okay, David reigned 40 years. If they just said that in the days of David there were 3 years of famine, some might say, well, it could have been any time in the course of that 40-year reign. No, it is 3 consecutive years of famine, folks. Is that a long time to go without rain and without crops? That's a long time, isn't it? When you look up the word famine, I don't know if anybody did, how is it defined? Anybody know? How would you define a famine? Scarcity. Anybody else? If you just look up the word itself in the Hebrew language means hunger. Hunger. Because a famine is what? A famine is a lack of crops. And if you have a lack of crops, that is eventually going to lead to a lack of food, and a lack of food leads to hunger, which most of us haven't experienced very much. Okay, now I realize some of you are starving right now. Okay, but we really haven't ever suffered much hunger. We are not told when the famine occurred. Okay, I can't tell you whether it's at the beginning of David's reign, whether it's at the middle of David's reign, whether it's toward the end of David's reign. Nobody really knows. It just says that there was a famine in the days of David, 3 years. Okay, so we're not really exactly certain as to when it transpired. All right. Famines are caused by, or cause all kinds of horrible conditions when they exist, don't they? What other things happen when there's hunger? I mean, when there's a famine, there's hunger. What else happens? Okay, your cattle die. Okay. Anything else? Okay, people become desperate, and oftentimes sometimes individuals who would never commit crimes will commit crimes in order to get food and sustenance for themselves, so the nation becomes somewhat more corrupt. Anything else? Death, yes, there's death. Sometimes, that hunger will lead to death. There's also, folks, disease, okay, and sickness because individuals' bodies, are not being fed properly. When you talk about 3 years, can you imagine that? What if a famine started today in the United States and we knew we've got to suffer through this 3 years until it's over? Folks, that is a long time, you know it? A long time. And it's just amazing to me. True or false? David refused to inquire of the Lord about the famine. False. And David inquired of the Lord. That little word inquired is a beautiful word too when you look it up. Okay? It means this, to seek the face of. Okay? Isn't that a pretty word? You ask yourself, well, I'm going to inquire of God. I'm going to seek the face of God. In other words, I'm going to go into God's presence and I'm going to talk to Him to find out why this is happening and what's going on. David knew that unless the children of Israel had been unfaithful to God in some way, a famine of this magnitude should not have come upon them. Is that true or false? That's true. Folks, when you go back to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 28, okay, there's a chapter there that is entitled The Blessings and the Cursings. Okay, the blessings and the cursings. And God has told Israel, as long as you obey my voice, as long as you do what I ask you to do, guess what? This will be a land of plenty. This will be a land of prosperity. You will have all that you need, but, listen to this next statement, but it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God to observe all of His commandments and His statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. Deuteronomy 28, verse 15. And when you read down through the list of those curses, guess what one of them is? Famine, hunger, okay, hardship. That's going to be one of the curses that comes upon this nation. If you don't obey me, guess what? Famine is coming. Here David and the nation had suffered famine, what? 3 years, folks. This wasn't a fluke of nature. David knew that. Yes, 1 year we might have very little rain. There may be a famine. We may have struggled just a little bit. Do people prepare for famines? Yeah. Usually prepare for famines. You set aside 10%, 20%, and even if you have to struggle that 1 year of famine, because you've set a little back, you can make it, can't you? But when it goes 2 years and 3 years, folks, there's nothing set aside for that period of a time. And David knows this is the 3rd year that this happened. Something's up. Something must be amiss in Israel. So what does he do? He inquires of God. He seeks the face of God. Now, what did the Lord say, or why did the Lord say the famine had come upon the land? Saul. That's what Bill says, Saul. And the Lord answered, it is for Saul. But now he doesn't stop there, does he? And for his bloody house, because he slew the Gibeonites. Ah, man. It is for Saul. Now I said a while ago that right now Saul is where? He's dead. His bones are buried in Jabesh Gilead, right? Saul's not even around. And now all of a sudden, God is punishing Israel for what? Something Saul did. It is for Saul. And what he did to the Gibeonites. Here's the first question. When in David's reign did this happen? What's the answer? We don't know. Okay? I don't know when it happened. I kind of believe that it's going to be after the first 7.5 years, because during those first 7.5, what was the kingdom? It was divided, wasn't it? David was only under the control of Judah at that particular time. He wasn't under control of the entire nation. But after that, I have no clue. My next question is this: why wasn't this incident recorded during the time of Saul's reign? Folks, you can go back and you can read the Bible about Saul's reign, and guess what you don't read about? You don't read about this. We've already studied Saul, haven't we? Did we read about Saul doing anything bad to the Gibeonites? It lets me know some interesting things about Scripture. Okay? God only records in Scripture what He feels is essential and necessary for us. Okay? Guys, if God recorded every little thing in a person's life, Saul's, David's, Solomon's, Moses', you couldn't carry the Bible. We'd all be pulling a wagon. What you toting there? Oh, I got Moses' books back here. You know, you couldn't carry it all. But God knows what He wants delivered. He knows what's important. He knows what we need. And therefore, sometimes He doesn't tell us everything until it's definitely needed by us. Okay? What were you going to say, Jim?
I was thinking, were the Gibeonites the ones that Saul actually saved that were going to put the riot out? And he called Israel to go over the king? Was that the Gibeonites?
No, I don't believe so. These Gibeonites are a different group of people. Okay, we'll get to what's going on in just a second here. Here's my next question. Well, y'all ask a question. Anybody else got a question? Nobody's got another question? What's your question? Here's one thinker at least. We'll see if she's thinking.
On the news, there is a lot about Israel today. We know that. What's the difference with Palestinians and the division? Aren't they divided today too?
Who's that? I tell you what you do. You put that question in a box back there in the back, and I'll answer that in about 2 or 3 years. I got a lot of questions ahead of you. Okay? No, I'm kidding. Just put it in the box, and I promise.
Now, is it relative today, Israel? It's always on the news.
Well, Israel's relative only in the sense of they're a nation that's among the world today. Okay? And they're an ally of the United States. Okay? But other than that, there's not a whole lot. Folks, here's my third question. Why did God take so long to punish this sin? Right? Why did He do that? You know, who does He say it's because of? Saul and his bloody house. And Saul's dead. And now all of a sudden, God says, well, I guess I better punish the house of Saul. Why didn't you, if this were done in the life of Saul, why didn't God punish it in the life of Saul? Ain't that a good question? You know, huh? That one won't even ever get answered. Guys, does God sometimes have His own timetable of things? And do you think God ever just holds back a while in order to see what man's going to do? And see how man's going to respond to things? Do you think anybody in the nation of Israel knew that Saul had slain these Gibeonites? Oh, everybody knew about it. Okay? Saul did. Saul's sons knew about it. His administration knew about it. Israel knew about it. The Gibeonites knew about it. You know else who knew about it? David knew about it. What had been done? What had been done? Nothing. Nothing. So guess what? God says it's time for something to be done, guys. I am not going to let this pass. This is a wicked, ungodly act that's been done by a king of Israel. And I am not going to let it pass even if you think it's okay to do so. So what does He do? He wakes Israel up at first, doesn't He? How does He wake them up? 3-year famine. Okay? Uh-oh. Something's what? Something's up. Something's wrong. We've done something bad. And so David knows that. And so David goes and he inquires of the Lord. And guess what? He's right, isn't he? What have we done? What's wrong? Why is this famine upon us? It is for Saul and his bloody house, because he slew the Gibeonites. You see, God finally does what? God brings justice to mankind on His terms, doesn't He? Now, God sometimes will allow man time to correct things. But there comes a time when God says, enough is enough. And justice needs to be served. Is God waiting even now to bring His wrath upon man? Oh yeah. He's waiting, folks. You know, one of the desires of the Christian ought to be what? Come, Lord Jesus. You see, most people won't say that because they don't want Him to come. Because if He comes, what? I won't be able to live my life the way I'm living it right now. We're so attached to this world and the things of this world and all the joys and the beauties of the world and the things that we have. Oh, don't come right now. Life's too good. But folks, if we were truly Christians, we'd want Him to come yesterday, right? But if He came yesterday, what would happen? Whoever repented today would have been lost yesterday. So God withholds sometimes His divine judgment and waits for mankind to do some things before He goes into action. Jeannie? Oh, sometimes. Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. You're absolutely right. Absolutely right. She asked, do sometimes the innocent suffer for the sins of the wicked? And the answer to that is yes, they do. Okay? Now, who are these Gibeonites? Anybody remember these Gibeonites? Yes. Remember when Joshua was taking over the land of Israel? He conquered what city first? Oh, come on. This is child classes. These ladies ought to be talking this stuff. First city taken in Israel, Jericho. Oh, yeah, that kid story. You know, yeah, that's the one. First city. What was the second city? Please know this one. Ai. Good, now I got you going, see. Ai. What happened there? They lost the first battle, didn't they? And then they conquered the city of Ai after they took care of old Achan for having stolen that Babylonian garment and the silver and the gold. And they conquered Ai. Well, guys, guess what it didn't look good for in Canaan? None of them. Okay? There were 7 tribes that made up the land of Canaan, and now Israel was marching along, conquered Jericho, conquered Ai, and guess what? It looks like the land's going to be taken, doesn't it? The Gibeonites, they're pretty smart dudes. They dress up, and they dress up in old garments, don't they? And they carry water in pitchers or those leather bags that just look like they're just as old and decrepit as they can be. And they get to Joshua and they tell him, we've been traveling a long time. And we're from a far, far country. And we want you to make a covenant with us. And if you'll make a covenant with us, we'll be your servants. And so guess what Joshua does? He inquires of God, and God says, no, they're lying to you. They're part of the Canaanites here in the land, and you need to destroy them. Is that what they did? No. They didn't seek the face of God. They immediately made a covenant with the Gibeonites. And part of that covenant was that we're not going to what? We're not going to harm you. We're not going to hurt you. We're not going to destroy you. Now, yes, once it was found out, they did put them under bondage to Israel. But their duty, their responsibility, their fulfillment of that covenant was to take care of the Gibeonites. Okay? That was their obligation. True or false? The Gibeonites were a part of Israel. That's false, isn't it? And the king called the Gibeonites and said unto them, and then here's this parenthetical expression. Now, the Canaanites were not of the children of Israel. So who were they a remnant of? The Amorites, folks. The Amorites. Anybody look them up? Try to find out who the Amorites are? No, I didn't do that. None of this Bible study interests me very much, you know. Huh? A major tribe where? Yes. Okay, yes. There were 7 tribes that were in the land of Canaan when the children of Israel crossed the Jordan to conquer it. The Amorites were one of them. Okay, so these individuals were one of those tribes that should have been slain by Israel, shouldn't they? Strictly speaking, the Bible says they were Hivites, according to Joshua 11, verse 19. In general, though, they were what? Amorites. In fact, they must have been the largest group of individuals because oftentimes the entire area was referred to as Amorites. Okay? And it just incorporated all the tribes, all those 7 tribes. So they were Amorites in general. They were Hivites in particular. They were children of Canaan through Ham, the son of who? Noah. Okay, so it goes back a long way. They're all kin. Isn't that something? Well, the reality is what? We're all kin, aren't we? If you go back far enough, at least go back to who? Noah. And the children of Israel had blank unto them, sworn unto them. Folks, this is where he goes back and he talks about what they had done all the way back in the days of Joshua. How many years had passed since that covenant had been made approximately? Anybody try to figure that out? It's been a long time, hasn't it? You've got to go, whatever part of David's reign it is, you've got to go back to that. Let's just say he's halfway through his reign. This is just, I don't know that. So you got 20 years. You got 40 years of who? Saul. Okay, that's how many years? 60. Before that, you had the reign of who? The judges. Folks, that was about a 490-year period. We're talking 550 to 560 years since the promise was made. Wow. That's a long time, isn't it? That little word, sworn, nobody looked that up. Okay, but it's got a pretty story too. Here's what the definition is. To seven oneself. Isn't that interesting? That's what it means in the Hebrew language. To seven oneself. What's the number 7? Anybody? Yes, it's a perfect number. Okay? Folks, if you did something, if you said something 7 times, then guess what? You are pledging your honor that you're going to keep that, right? It kind of reminded me, maybe what we need to do during wedding ceremonies is get them to say, I do 7 times. Okay? Maybe that would tighten some of these marriage vows. Because what's that? Yeah, that's what it means, you know, to swear, to be sworn. They sworn themselves to an oath. It's as if they had repeated the declaration over and over and over and over again. We're in a covenant relationship with you. We will not harm you. You are safe with us, the Israelites. You'd sworn to do this. Is there a lesson there? Is there a lesson there? Nobody knows a lesson that's there. How long had it been? 550, 560 years. And guess what? God was still holding Israel accountable to their word. Folks, you make an oath. Guess what? Fulfill your oath. And it doesn't matter what. How much time passes. It doesn't matter if the parties involved are different. Okay, Joshua was dead. The people that he had made the agreement were dead. But guess what? The peoples were still alive. Israel was still alive. The Gibeonites were still alive. The covenant was still in effect. Ooh, I could make a real personal application if you want one. When we became Christians, did we make a pledge? Yep. I'll be faithful till when? Till death. Don't matter how many years goes by, folks. I'll be faithful till death. Is God concerned about our oaths and pledges? Yes. What did Saul seek to do in his zeal to the children of Israel and Judah? Yes, and Saul sought to slay them in his zeal to the children of Israel and Judah. Now notice question 9. See, I knew you'd just skip over that if I didn't put it in there. Okay. What is the meaning of the phrase, his zeal to the children of Israel and Judah? What's that mean? Okay, when you look up the word zeal, okay, it means what? Okay? Passion, desire. In the Greek language, it refers to as a burning. Okay? It's a burning deep within the soul of an individual. Okay? It is just, he had a desire, a deep desire, a burning desire to do what? To the children of Israel and Judah. Okay? What does that mean? What does that mean? Wouldn't you love to talk to Saul? Hey, Saul, come here. Sit down here, bro. You know these Gibeonites that you didn't have to die for? Okay? Tell me exactly why you slew those people. Right? He may have said something like this. Hey, Vic, they're Amorites. They're Hivites. They're enemies of God's people. That may have been one of his justifications, right? He may have said something like this. That agreement that was made way back there in the days of Joshua, that agreement should have never, ever, ever been made. And yet they made it, and they shouldn't have. He may have said something like this. Have you seen the Gibeonites lately? Have you seen how they live among us? There's been some sins that they've committed on their part against us, and that's not fair either. They deserve what? They deserve to die. Who knows? But he wanted somehow to make himself look good in the eyes of who? Israel and Judah. And I don't have a clue as to exactly what it was. I put down this note. Folks, this was misguided zeal. Turn over to Romans chapter 10. Somebody read Romans 10, 1 through 3. Nope. Verse 2. For I bear them record. Who's he talking about? He's talking about the Jews. Brethren, my heart's desire to God for Israel is that they might be saved. He's talking about the Jewish nation. Now notice verse 2. I bear them record that they have a what? A zeal for God. But not what? But not according to knowledge. Folks, there is such a thing as misguided what? Misguided zeal. Okay? In your mind, you think you're doing a good thing. In your mind, you think you're doing a right thing. In your mind, you're giving your heart to this. And guess what? You're in violation of the will of God. And that's where the Jews were, going about to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted themselves to the righteousness of God. Folks, it's God's way or there is no way. Listen to this text. If a man vow a vow unto the Lord, or swear an oath to bind his soul with a bond, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceedeth out of his mouth. Numbers 20, verse 2. Had they made a vow, had they made a bond, had they made an oath to the Gibeonites? Yes, sir. And guess what? In his misguided zeal, Saul violated the Word of God. Folks, we can do that. You know it? We can have all kinds of wonderful intentions. We can have all kinds of wonderful feelings about what we're doing. And I bet Saul thought, man, look at me. I'm finally righting an injustice of the past. Getting rid of those old Gibeonites. Look at me, Israel. And guess what? Did it bring hardship on the nation? Big time. Big time. Now here's the next interesting part of this chapter, number 10. David asked the Gibeonites what he could do for them to make atonement. True or false? Oh man, listen to this. Wherefore David said unto the Gibeonites, what shall I do for you? And wherewithal shall I make the atonement, that ye may bless the inheritance of the Lord? Relative to the famine, who did he inquire of? God. Relative to the solution to the problem, who did he inquire of? The Gibeonites. Isn't that interesting? You see, I would think that he would go to God and he would say, God, why is this famine upon us? It's because of what Saul did to the Gibeonites. And then he would have asked God what? Yeah, what do you want us to do in order to make this right? Oh no. He just walks out from the presence of God and goes right to the Gibeonites. He says, what can we do for you? Well, wouldn't you love to be in that position? I'd love to be a Gibeonite right then, wouldn't you? Because guess what? David is asking them, whatever you want us to do to make this right, guess what? We'll do. Guess what I'm banking on now? I'm banking on the character of the Gibeonites, who are who? Enemies of the people of God. Wow. That's kind of scary, isn't it? It is. It's a tough position. Clark makes the statement, it is very strange that a choice of this kind should be left to such a people. Why not ask this of God Himself? I don't know. Define atonement. Forgiveness, make amends. Anybody else? Reparation. Okay. The literal definition in the Hebrew language means to cover. Okay. It's a covering. That's what it means. Sin has been exposed. What do we need to do to what? Cover it. Okay. In other words, what do we need to do to get rid of it? Jesus is our what? Our atonement. He's our what? Our covering for sin, okay? To cover up, to cover over, to atone for sin. What things did the Gibeonites not want for atonement? Yes. They did not want Saul's silver. They didn't want Saul's gold. They didn't want his house. Boy. And they didn't want any man in Israel. That's interesting, isn't it? In other words, we want a specific group of individuals to suffer. Folks, does this tell you anything about the Gibeonites by now? Folks, for 500 years, guess who they have lived among? They did among the Jews, hadn't they? Now, and as far as I know, the only horrible act ever committed against them was done by who? Was done by Saul. So now when they're asked, what can we do for you to make amends? Guess what they don't do? They don't beg to get rich. We want all his silver, we want all his gold, we want all his land, we want all his house, we want everything. Didn't ask for that. They didn't go and say, well, we want this guy and this guy and this guy and this guy in Israel and just pick, 50 or 100 people. We don't want just anybody in Israel. They wanted a select group of people, didn't they? True or false, David appeared to be willing to do anything for the Gibeonites. Appears that way, doesn't he? He said unto them, what ye shall say, that will I do for you. And they answered the king, the man that blanked us. What is that? Consumed us, and that blanked against us, devised against us, that we should be destroyed from the remaining in any of the coast of Israel. Folks, who do they want to die? Someone connected to who? The man who had done this. Is that justice? That's justice, folks. Okay? Isn't it? I'm just kind of amazed at the Gibeonites. David would have done almost anything to have made atonement, anything to appease them. And the only thing they want is what? We want blood from the house of who? From the man who's done this. Right? Pretty just group of individuals. I put this down here, this question. How do we feel about Saul when we hear of these actions he took against the Gibeonites? How do you feel about him? We already know what he's like, right? Okay? He'd already sinned against God and had the kingdom rent out from under him because of his transgressions. He was a very proud, arrogant individual. And now we hear this about him, don't we? Oh, Saul. How in the world? Here's my question, though. Have we ever wished the same on another person? Perhaps we have attempted to do to another what Saul did to these individuals. We don't like them. We don't care for them. We kind of consider them our enemy. And so what do? Try to destroy them. Oh, we don't ever act like Saul, do we? What did the Gibeonites request of David? Yes, let 7 men of his sons be delivered unto us. 7 indicating what? Perfection. 7 for 1. Right? Saul was the man who had ordered this. But it's going to be 7 of his sons who would die. What were they going to do with these men? Yes, and we will hang them up unto the Lord in Gibeah, listen to this, of Saul. Gibeah of Saul, whom the Lord did choose. Folks, there's a mouthful in there. Did you know that? Number one, we're going to do what? We're going to hang them up. What had happened to Saul and Jonathan and his other sons? They were slain and their bodies were what? Hanged up on a wall, were they not? Folks, that's what these individuals now are going to do to 7 more of Saul's kinmen. Okay, they're going to hang them up on a wall. Where are they going to hang them? Just anywhere? Oh no, we're going to hang them in Gibeah, which is the home of who? Of Saul. Can you imagine? Go to Gibeah, right outside the city gates, there's this big cliff that's sitting there, this rock wall, and guess what they do? They just pin the bodies of those guys on that wall. Anybody who comes out, anybody comes in, starts asking some questions. Who are these dudes? You walk inside, you sit down to eat, your lunch that day. Hey, I noticed coming in, there's 7 guys pinned to the wall out there. Who are those guys? You hadn't heard? That's Saul's sons. They were pinned to that wall by the Gibeonites because of what Saul had done to the Gibeonites several years ago during his reign. His own hometown, folks. You think Saul still had some kinsfolk in Gibeah? May have. You know what it was? It was a humiliation. Now listen to what else they say in here. Whom the Lord did choose. Ugh. You see, they're even throwing a little bit of what? A little bit of humiliation toward whom? Toward God. This is the man who did it to us, and it's the one that what? Your God chose to be king. Wow. You see, getting a little blurb in there, don't they? Unbelievable. True or false? David refused the request. False. He gave them the 7 men. What happened to them? Did they hang them up? Yes. But there was one who what? There was one who was spared. Who was it? Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan. You want to hear something? Listen to this. And thou shalt not only, while yet I live, show me the kindness of the Lord, that I die not, but also thou shalt not cut off thy kindness from my house forever. No, not when the Lord hath cut off the enemies of David, every one of them from the face of the earth. 1 Samuel 20, 14 and 15. Folks, that was a covenant David made with whom? Jonathan, years and years and years ago. Okay? Jonathan, I'm going to take care of your house. Who had they requested? One of the sons of Saul. Boy, he would have been a great one, wouldn't he? You're talking about Saul, and then Jonathan, who was one of his commanders, and then Jonathan's son, the grandson through Jonathan. Boy, he'd have been a perfect sacrifice, wouldn't he? David said, you don't get Mephibosheth. Folks, this is the second time Mephibosheth has done this. Whew. You know what? First time was when David called him in, right? And he wanted to express kindness to him. Now he saves his life again, doesn't he? Okay. There were 7 sons who were taken. 2 from a woman by the name of Rizpah, a concubine of Saul. And then there were 5 who were sons through whom? No, wasn't by Michal. She took care of them. As far as the way the biblical text reads, they were through Merab. M-E-R-A-B, Merab, who was the daughter of who? The daughter of Saul. Okay? So 2 sons through Rizpah, a concubine, and then 5 sons through a daughter of Saul by the name of Merab. Okay? Don't know much about Merab. The Bible doesn't talk about Merab very much. In fact, some individuals don't even think that this term Michal is a copyist error in the biblical text, that it should be Merab all the way through. Okay? I don't know about that or not. Once these boys had died, what did Rizpah do? Yeah. Guys, can you imagine? She spread sackcloth out on a rock because guess what? She's about to live there for a while. Okay? It is kind of uncomfortable. But you'll about do anything for your who? For your children. It shows a mother's love, does it not? Ain't no birds eating my boy. Ain't no animals going to get to them, folks. It could have been 5 to 6 months that she stayed there. She stayed there from the beginning of the harvest until the what? Until the rain. Folks, the rains didn't start until October. That's a long time, isn't it? That's a long time to be fanning off birds and wild beasts. Folks, a mother's love doesn't stop after her children die, does it? Doesn't happen. Who went and got the bones? David. And he not only got their bones, but he went and got who else's bones? Saul and Jonathan's. He brings those bones back and he properly buries all of the bones, doesn't he? Now what's interesting is once that was done, the Bible says this: God was entreated for the land. True or false? True. And after that, God was entreated for the land. What does it mean? Anybody look up the word entreat? appeased. What'd you say? Employ or beg, yes. In the Hebrew language, it means to burn incense and worship to. Okay? In other words, this was a sacrifice that God what? Accepted. And therefore, what happened? If God's entreated for the land, what happened? The famine comes to a what? Comes to an end. Okay? Folks, these are just good stories, you know it? And I think one of the reasons they're in there is just because there's a lot of good lessons for us about just little bits of how you and I are supposed to live. Okay? And the kind of characters that we're supposed to have. So very, very interesting. And that's the way the next 2 or 3 chapters are going to be. Just some interesting stuff. Thank you, thank you.